In the summer of 70 AD, the Roman Empire brought the full weight of its military might against the city of Jerusalem. What followed was one of the most catastrophic sieges in ancient history, a 5-month ordeal that would end with the destruction of the Second Temple, the death of over 1 million people according to ancient sources, and the effective end of ancient Jewish national existence. But this isn't a story pieced together from fragmentary evidence or archaeological speculation. We have something extraordinary, detailed eyewitness accounts from someone who was actually there. Flavius Josephus, a Jewish commander who later worked for the Romans, documented the siege in shocking detail. His account in the Jewish War remains our primary source for understanding what happened during those terrible months. Today, we are going to walk through the fall of Jerusalem using these eyewitness accounts. We'll examine what Josephus saw, what Roman historians recorded, and what archaeological evidence tells us about one of antiquity's most devastating military campaigns. This is history written in real time by people who witnessed the events firsthand. To understand the fall of Jerusalem, we need to understand how the Jewish-Roman War began. Josephus himself was deeply involved in the events leading up to the catastrophe. By 66 AD, tensions between the Jewish population of Judea and their Roman overlords had reached a breaking point. Roman procurators had grown increasingly corrupt and contemptuous of Jewish customs. The final spark came when Gessius Florus, the Roman procurator, seized 17 talents from the temple treasury. When the people of Jerusalem protested, Florus unleashed his soldiers on the city, crucifying even Jewish citizens who held Roman citizenship. Josephus describes the scene: the Roman soldiers breaking into houses, killing everyone they found, the streets running with blood. The massacre drove moderates like Josephus into the rebel camp, though he remained deeply ambivalent about the wisdom of fighting Rome. The Jewish revolt spread quickly. Rebel forces achieved early victories, including the stunning defeat of Cestius Gallus, the governor of Syria, who lost an entire legion when he attempted to retake Jerusalem. This success proved disastrous in the long term. It convinced many Jews that God was on their side and that they could defeat Rome. Josephus knew better. He had seen the might of the Roman military machine and understood that the early victories had simply ensured that Rome would respond with overwhelming force. Emperor Nero dispatched his most capable general, Vespasian, along with his son Titus, to crush the rebellion. They brought with them 3 full legions, the V Macedonica, the X Fretensis, and the 15 Apollinaris, plus auxiliary forces, totaling some 60,000 men. Josephus himself was given command of Galilee and tried to prepare the region's defenses. When Vespasian's forces arrived in 67 AD, they systematically reduced Galilean strongholds. Josephus made his stand at Jotapata, where he held out for 47 days before the fortress fell. Rather than dying with his men, Josephus surrendered to the Romans, a decision that would brand him a traitor to many Jews but also preserve his life and allow him to witness and record what came next. In Roman captivity, Josephus made a prophecy that would change his fate. He told Vespasian that the general would become emperor. It seemed like desperate flattery from a captured enemy, but in 69 AD, after Nero's suicide and a year of civil war, Vespasian did indeed become emperor. Grateful and impressed, Vespasian freed Josephus and took him into his household. Josephus would remain with the Roman forces as they marched on Jerusalem, serving as interpreter and witness. By the spring of 70 AD, Vespasian had returned to Rome to claim his throne, leaving his son Titus to complete the conquest of Judea. Jerusalem was the final objective, the heart of the rebellion. Titus arrived with 4 legions and began surrounding the city just before Passover, when Jerusalem was crowded with pilgrims from across Judea. What should have been a time of celebration became a trap. Josephus estimates that over 1 million people were inside the city when the siege began. Though modern historians consider this figure inflated, the population certainly swelled far beyond its normal size. The city Titus faced was formidable. Jerusalem sat on a rocky plateau, protected by deep valleys on 3 sides. Herod the Great had built massive walls and towers decades earlier, and the rebels had strengthened these defenses. The city had 3 concentric walls on its vulnerable northern side, each one higher and stronger than the last. The Temple Mount itself was a fortress within the fortress, its walls towering above everything else. But Jerusalem's greatest weakness was internal division. 3 rival factions controlled different parts of the city, led by John of Giscala, Simon bar Jora, and Eleazar ben Simon. These groups spent as much time fighting each other as preparing to fight the Romans. Josephus describes how they burned each other's food supplies in factional violence, destroying provisions that might have allowed the city to withstand a longer siege. Titus established 4 camps around the city and began the siege in earnest. Roman engineering prowess was on full display as thousands of soldiers cut down every tree within miles to build siege works. Josephus describes forests disappearing as the Romans constructed massive earthen ramps against the walls, built siege towers taller than the city's defenses, and positioned artillery, ballistas and catapults to bombard the defenders. The Romans offered terms. Josephus himself was sent to the walls multiple times to plead with the defenders to surrender. He reminded them of Rome's power, of the futility of resistance, of the disaster that awaited them. Each time, he was met with curses and missiles. Many Jews saw him as the worst kind of traitor, a turncoat who had abandoned his people. On one occasion, Josephus was struck on the head by a stone while trying to negotiate. The defenders fought with desperate courage. They made sorties against the Roman siege works, attempting to burn the wooden structures. They tunneled under the Roman ramps, hoping to collapse them. Jewish fighters used every advantage of their defensive position, raining stones and arrows down on the Romans from the walls. But Roman persistence was relentless. After 15 days of bombardment, the first wall fell. The Romans poured through, and the defenders fell back to the second wall. 5 days later, that wall too was breached. The Jews retreated to the third and final wall, and to the Temple Mount itself. As the siege dragged on through the hot summer months, the situation inside Jerusalem deteriorated into nightmare. This is where Josephus's account becomes almost unbearable to read. He spares no detail in describing what starvation does to a trapped population. The rival factions had destroyed much of the city's food supply in their fighting, and now there was nothing left. Josephus describes people gnawing on leather, eating hay and grass, consuming things no human should eat. The wealthy, who had hoarded provisions, became targets. Gangs of starving men would break into houses, torturing the inhabitants to reveal where food was hidden. The smell of cooking would bring desperate crowds, ready to kill for a scrap of food. Bodies accumulated in the streets faster than they could be buried. Josephus claims that over 600,000 corpses were carried out of the city during the siege, though this number, like many ancient figures, is probably exaggerated. Still, the mortality rate was clearly catastrophic. Entire families died together in their homes. Then Josephus describes something even worse. He recounts the story of a woman named Mary, daughter of Eleazar, from the village of Bethzubah. She was from a wealthy family and had fled to Jerusalem for safety, only to become trapped in the siege. As famine tightened its grip, rebel fighters repeatedly raided her house, taking whatever food they could find. Finally, driven mad by hunger and rage, she killed her infant son, roasted his body, and ate half of it. When the smell of cooking meat drew the fighters back, they found the other half of the child's body. Even these hardened men were horrified. Josephus includes this story not for shock value but as evidence of how completely the siege had destroyed normal human society. The laws of nature and humanity itself had broken down. Mothers were eating their children, an abomination that Josephus presents as fulfillment of ancient prophecies about God's judgment on Israel. People began attempting to escape the city at night, fleeing to the Roman lines. Some were captured by the rebels and crucified inside of the walls. John of Giscla and Simon Bar-Jonah hoped to deter others from deserting. But the exodus continued. Thousands made it to Roman lines, hoping for mercy. They found little. Roman soldiers discovered that some refugees had swallowed gold coins before fleeing, hoping to smuggle their wealth out. Soon, rumors spread through the Roman camp that Jewish refugees had gold in their stomachs. Syrian auxiliary forces began cutting open refugees to search for coins. Josephus claims that up to 2,000 people were disemboweled in a single night before Titus learned what was happening and ordered it stopped. But the killing continued in secret. Titus, according to Josephus, was horrified by the suffering inside the city. He repeatedly sent Josephus to the walls to offer terms. But the rebel leaders refused every offer. They believed that God would intervene to save his holy city and temple. Surrender was unthinkable. By August, Titus focused his assault on the Temple Mount itself. This was the symbolic and spiritual heart of Jerusalem, the dwelling place of God according to Jewish belief. Its capture would mean the end of the rebellion. The temple complex was an extraordinary structure. Herod the Great had spent decades expanding and beautifying it, creating one of the ancient world's architectural marvels. The sanctuary itself gleamed with gold plating that reflected the sun. Massive stones, some weighing hundreds of tons, formed walls that towered over the surrounding city. The Temple Mount was its own fortress, with thick walls and gates that the rebels had fortified further. Roman siege ramps crept toward the temple walls. The defenders fought for every inch, making repeated sorties to burn the siege works. But Roman engineering eventually prevailed. The outer courts fell first, then the inner courts. The fighting moved into the temple complex itself, soldiers battling among the sacred precincts. What happened next remains one of history's most controversial moments. According to Josephus, Titus had explicitly ordered that the temple sanctuary be preserved. He wanted it intact, perhaps as a trophy, perhaps out of respect for an ancient holy place. But during the final assault on August 29, 70 AD, a Roman soldier threw a burning torch through a window of the sanctuary. The fire spread quickly. The wooden interior, the tapestries, the accumulated oil and incense, everything fed the flames. Soon the entire sanctuary was ablaze. Josephus describes how the fierce roar mingled with the screams of the dying and the crash of collapsing structures. The defenders and civilians trapped in the temple courts were caught between fire and sword. Some chose to jump into the flames rather than surrender. Others were cut down as they fled. Titus, Josephus claims, tried to order the fire extinguished, but his soldiers were beyond control. The temple had resisted them for so long, cost them so many casualties, that when the moment came, military discipline gave way to fury and greed. Soldiers poured into the burning temple, slaughtering everyone they found, tearing down decorations, looting whatever they could carry. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing a few decades later, offers a different account. He suggests that Titus deliberately ordered the temple's destruction, seeing it as the source of Jewish resistance. Roman policy often involved destroying the religious centers of rebellious peoples. Whether the fire was accident or design, the result was the same. The Second Temple was destroyed. Josephus describes the scene with the eye of someone who was there. He speaks of the blood running down the temple steps and rivers, of corpses piled so high that soldiers walked on bodies to pursue the fleeing defenders. The sanctuary's fall came exactly on the same date that Babylonians had destroyed Solomon's temple 656 years earlier, a coincidence that Josephus and other Jews saw as divine punishment. With the temple gone, organized resistance collapsed. The rebels fell back to the upper city for a final stand, but they were broken. In September, the Romans breached the last walls. Simon Bar Jora and John of Giscala were captured hiding in underground tunnels. The siege was over. The Romans spent weeks clearing Jerusalem of survivors and looting whatever remained. Titus ordered most of the city demolished. The walls were torn down, buildings destroyed. Only 3 towers and part of the western wall were left standing. The towers to show future generations what the Romans had overcome, the wall to quarter the legion that would remain to occupy the ruins. Josephus provides detailed casualty figures, though modern historians treat these numbers with skepticism. He claims 1.1 million people died during the siege and 97,000 were taken prisoner. These figures are almost certainly exaggerated. Jerusalem simply couldn't have held that many people, and ancient authors routinely inflated numbers. But even if we reduce Josephus's figures by half or more, the death toll was clearly catastrophic. Tens of thousands certainly died, whether from violence, starvation, or disease. The survivors faced grim fates. The elderly and infirm were killed. Young men deemed suitable were enslaved or sent to Roman arenas to die in gladiatorial combat. The tallest and most handsome were saved for Titus's triumph in Rome. Women and children were sold in slave markets across the empire. So many Jewish slaves flooded the market that prices collapsed. Josephus describes Titus's triumph in Rome the following year. The procession featured spectacular displays of captured treasures from the temple, the golden menorah, the table of showbread, the silver trumpets. These were paraded through Rome's streets as Titus rode in his chariot, with Simon Bar Jora dragged in chains behind him. At the triumph's conclusion, Simon was ritually strangled in the Forum, the traditional fate of defeated enemy leaders. John of Giscala was imprisoned for life. The Arch of Titus, which still stands in Rome today, commemorates this victory. Its reliefs show Roman soldiers carrying the temple menorah and other sacred objects. For nearly 2,000 years, traditional Jews refused to walk under this arch, seeing it as a monument to their greatest catastrophe. The destruction of the temple had profound consequences for Judaism. The center of Jewish religious life, the place where sacrifices were offered, where pilgrims gathered 3 times a year, where the high priest entered the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, was gone. The priesthood, which had maintained the temple service, lost its purpose. The Sadducees, a major Jewish sect closely tied to the temple, essentially disappeared. But Judaism survived by adapting. Rabbinic Judaism, centered on Torah study and prayer rather than temple sacrifice, emerged as the dominant form of Jewish practice. The Pharisees, particularly the school of Hillel, developed new ways of observing Jewish law without a temple. In many ways, modern Judaism descends from this post-70 AD transformation. For the Jewish people, 70 AD became a defining trauma, commemorated annually on the fast day of Tisha B'Av. It represented not just a military defeat but a theological crisis. How could God allow his temple to be destroyed? How should Jews live without the temple's rituals? These questions shaped Jewish thought for centuries. The fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD stands as one of ancient history's most thoroughly documented catastrophes. Through Josephus's eyewitness account, we have remarkable detail about the siege, the military operations, the factional conflicts, the famine, the final assault, and the temple's destruction. Josephus's testimony is not without bias. He had reasons to portray Titus favorably and to blame the Jewish rebels for bringing disaster on their people. Modern scholars read his account critically, checking it against archaeological evidence and Roman sources where possible. But the basic outline of events is well established and widely accepted by historians. Archaeological evidence supports Josephus's account in striking ways. Excavations in Jerusalem have uncovered arrowheads and ballista stones from the siege, burned remains of buildings, and even skeletal evidence of violence. The destruction layer from 70 AD is clearly visible in multiple sites around the city. The placement of the 10th Legion's camp on the ruins has been confirmed. The Western Wall, the surviving remnant of the Temple Mount's retaining wall, remains Judaism's holiest site, a tangible connection to what was lost. When you see photographs of people praying at the Western Wall, you're seeing the last physical trace of the temple that Titus's soldiers destroyed. What makes the fall of Jerusalem historically significant beyond its immediate tragedy is how it shaped the development of both Judaism and Christianity. The destruction of the temple forced Judaism to reinvent itself, leading to the rabbinic tradition that has defined Jewish practice ever since. For early Christianity, the temple's fall was seen as vindicating Jesus' prophecy that not one stone will be left on another. The event played a role in the final separation of Christianity from Judaism. From a Roman perspective, the Jewish War was a significant, but not unique military campaign, one of many revolts crushed during the empire's long history. But Romans recognized Jerusalem's symbolic importance. The Flavian dynasty, Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian, promoted their victory extensively. They built the Colosseum in Rome partially from the proceeds of the temple's treasures. The message was clear: Rome was supreme, and even the God of the Jews could not save his temple. For students of history, the fall of Jerusalem offers rare insight into ancient siege warfare, the brutality of Roman military power, the dynamics of rebellion and resistance, and the human cost of war. Josephus's account, for all its biases, preserves voices and experiences that would otherwise be lost. We hear the defenders' defiance, witness the besieged population suffering, and see how an ancient city died. The eyewitness accounts of Jerusalem's fall remind us that history is not just dates and events, but human experiences. Behind Josephus's statistics were individual tragedies: families separated, children starving, communities destroyed. The ruins and ashes of 70 AD contained countless personal stories that we can only imagine. Thank you for watching. Understanding historical events like the fall of Jerusalem requires carefully examining our sources, recognizing their strengths and limitations, cross-checking accounts where possible, and maintaining appropriate scholarly skepticism while respecting the testimonies of those who lived through history's darkest moments.